This was never really about justice. It was about control. Nearly 4,000 years ago, long before banks existed, before markets were formalized, before anyone spoke about economic systems, one ruler grasped a truth most societies still struggle to accept. Civilizations don't fall apart because people become evil. They fall apart when financial rules stop working, and when those rules break, order collapses into conflict. Welcome to a story where power, money, and survival intersect, and where ancient history is far more calculated than it appears. When people hear the name Hammurabi, they imagine revenge, harsh punishments, an unforgiving world ruled by stone-carved justice. It's a powerful image, it's dramatic, and it's deeply misleading. Because when you look past the famous phrases and examine what was actually written in Babylon around 1754 BCE, a different picture emerges. The Code of Hammurabi wasn't designed to define morality. It was designed to stabilize an economy on the edge of chaos. Out of the hundreds of rules carved into Hammurabi's code, very few focus on violence or personal revenge. Most of them revolve around transactions, borrowing, repayment, labor, responsibility, failure, and compensation. These weren't abstract ideas. They were the mechanics that determined whether a growing society could function without tearing itself apart. Once a population moves beyond a small kin-based group, survival stops depending on shared values and starts depending on systems. Babylon understood this early. This city was not built as a philosophical project, it was built as a logistical one. Positioned between major trade corridors, Babylon moved goods and obligations across vast distances. Grain flowed from fields to storehouses, silver moved between lenders and merchants, labor moved between builders and landowners, credit tied all of it together. Farmers borrowed against harvests that didn't yet exist. Traders borrowed to fund journeys that might fail. Builders accepted payment up front for structures that might collapse. Every step relied on trust, and trust without enforcement doesn't survive scale. Without shared rules, economic loss turns personal. A failed harvest becomes a family crisis. An unpaid loan becomes a vendetta. A collapsed house becomes justification for retaliation. In societies without formal enforcement, disputes don't stay economic for long, they become violent. Hammurabi didn't step into a calm world and decide to impose morality. He inherited an unstable economic network and recognized the danger of uncertainty. This is the crucial misunderstanding about the code. It was not designed to make people virtuous, it was designed to make outcomes predictable. Predictability is the foundation of any functioning economy. When people don't know who bears responsibility after failure, trade freezes, lending dries up, cooperation collapses. People retreat from exchange and rely on force instead. Hammurabi understood that chaos doesn't come from bad intentions, it comes from undefined liability. So the code did something radical for its time. It defined responsibility in advance. It answered the question every transaction eventually faces: who pays when things go wrong? Once that answer is known, behavior changes, risk becomes measurable, incentives form, systems emerge. This is where law quietly becomes economics. Debt was the most dangerous problem Babylon faced. In Mesopotamia, debt wasn't symbolic. It was immediate and physical. A farmer who couldn't repay grain didn't receive a notice. He lost land, he lost freedom. His family could be absorbed into servitude over a single failed season. Left unchecked, this didn't just harm individuals. It stripped the economy of producers. It weakened tax revenue. It destabilized food supply. Permanent debt didn't punish failure. It destroyed capacity. The code responded by limiting damage. Interest had ceilings. Debt servitude had time limits. In cases of floods or disasters, repayment could be delayed or suspended. These weren't gestures of kindness. They were structural safeguards. A dead or enslaved farmer produces nothing. A king without production loses control. Hammurabi wasn't rescuing the poor. He was maintaining the engine that kept the state alive. What looks like mercy through a modern lens was, in reality, risk containment. The goal was not justice. The goal was continuity. Once debt was controlled, the next threat was uncertainty in agreements. Hammurabi's laws treated contracts with brutal clarity. Motives didn't matter, outcomes did. If a builder constructed a house and it collapsed, the consequences were clearly assigned. If a merchant lost entrusted goods, responsibility followed him. If an agent failed to deliver, excuses carried no weight. This wasn't cruelty, it was precision. Clear responsibility reshapes behavior. Builders calculate safety differently when failure carries consequences. Merchants manage risk when loss doesn't disappear into ambiguity. Trade becomes safer not because people become better, but because systems punish negligence. The code didn't eliminate failure, it distributed it. Someone always absorbed the loss. This principle is ancient. Loss doesn't vanish just because circumstances are unfortunate. Risk must land somewhere. Long before insurance markets or corporate shields, Hammurabi understood what we now call moral hazard. If people don't bear the cost of failure, they take reckless risks. When multiplied across a society, that recklessness becomes collapse. Labor followed the same logic. Wages were standardized. Different professions had fixed compensation, not because it was fair, but because it reduced friction. Negotiation creates conflict. Conflict creates instability. Fixed expectations reduce disputes before they began. Workers knew what they would earn. Employers knew what they would pay. Predictability replaced bargaining. Markets don't function on goodwill. They function on consistency. Hammurabi wasn't designing happiness. He was maintaining circulation. Consistency lowers transaction costs. It keeps commerce moving. It prevents disagreements from escalating into violence. In a world without appeals or regulators, these rules became the infrastructure of trust. But embedded within this system was a truth that modern narratives prefer to soften. The rules were not equal. Punishment and liability varied by class. The same injury carried different consequences depending on who was harmed. Financial responsibility shifted with social status. Power wasn't hidden, it was formalized. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was deliberate design. Elites held land, resources, and political authority. Protecting them stabilized the system. Lower classes absorbed more risk because the system depended on that imbalance. This wasn't fairness. It was hierarchy maintenance. Every economic system must decide where losses land. Hammurabi made that decision explicit. The law didn't disguise inequality, it declared it. When elites were harmed, penalties were severe. When commoners were harmed, compensation was monetary. When slaves were harmed, losses were treated as damaged property. This logic extended everywhere. Surgeons faced extreme punishment for harming nobles, but replacement costs for harming slaves. Builders faced execution if owners died, but compensation if slaves did. Human value was calculated through economic position. This wasn't moral reasoning. It was accounting. The collapse of an elite rippled outward through land, labor, and supply chains. The collapse of a laborer barely registered. Protecting the top wasn't corruption, it was shock absorption. Cold arithmetic governed everything, and it still does. This is where ancient law begins to feel modern, because what Hammurabi etched into stone, contemporary societies encode into policy. Bankruptcy laws don't exist to reward failure, they exist to manage it. Debt relief isn't generosity, it's containment. Central banks intervene not out of compassion, but because uncontrolled collapse spreads faster than stability. 4,000 years separate Babylon from modern economies, but the logic remains intact. When debt threatens the system, rules bend. When instability climbs upward, intervention appears. When instability remains contained below, it's often ignored. This isn't ideology, it's structure. Inflation follows the same principle. It isn't just rising prices. It's redistributed loss. It erodes savings. It eases debt burdens. It shifts pressure from borrowers to holders of currency. That mechanism isn't modern. Hammurabi applied it when he capped interest and paused debts after disasters. You don't allow the financial system to destroy the productive base. It depends on you spread the damage. Modern societies speak endlessly about fairness and free markets. Babylon was more honest. The code never pretended equality existed. It told people exactly where they stood. It didn't claim morality governed money. It admitted that money shaped morality, that honesty created durability. Predictable rules encourage participation. Participation fuels growth. Growth consolidates power. Hammurabi understood that people would continue producing and trading if the rules remained stable, even if harsh. Chaos doesn't emerge from inequality alone. It emerges from uncertainty. Modern finance still operates on this foundation. The difference is visibility. Today's rules are buried in legal language and balance sheets. Babylon carved them into stone. There was no illusion of fairness, only structure. This is why modern systems feel disorienting. People sense immorality and search for virtue where none was promised. Economic systems aren't designed to be just. They're designed to survive. Survival demands sacrifice. Someone always absorbs loss. The only question is whether that reality is visible or hidden. Hammurabi didn't offer freedom, he offered order, and in doing so, he revealed something many still resist. Financial security comes from understanding how risk moves through a system, from knowing which rules bend and which don't, from recognizing who the system protects when pressure rises. That is the real legacy of the Code of Hammurabi. not revenge, not cruelty, but the acknowledgement that once money enters society, power must choose between chaos and control. And control always prioritizes the system before the individual. Civilizations learn this lesson repeatedly, usually in crisis. History doesn't loop, it sharpens. The methods evolve, the terminology shifts, but the foundation stays intact. Debt still shapes behavior. Rules still determine who absorbs loss. Power still intervenes to preserve order before it ever worries about fairness. And those who see this clearly aren't surprised when systems protect themselves. They anticipate it, because the oldest economic truth humanity ever learned was never about morality. It was about endurance, about preventing collapse long enough for power to reorganize itself. 4,000 years have passed since Babylon, yet the same logic governs our world today. If this reframed the way you think about history, economics, or power, subscribe. The past doesn't just explain the present, it prepares you for what comes next.